Suze, thank you very much indeed for your welcome. Suze is quite right. We didn't overlap at Wycliffe, which is why she made the mistake of inviting me here. Go easy on her. She didn't know any better. And the problem of evil is actually the area of my academic research. It's what I've given my academic life to, and which is why my students call me Dr. Evil. At least I hope that's why they call me Dr. Evil. There may be other possible reasons. How long do I have? I don't mean medically. I mean... 11:15. Well, okay, so if we go till 11:14, we should be fine. I just want to say before we start that in a group this size, there's usually somebody for whom this is not an academic subject. This is an area of deep pain for them. It's something that they are going through and that they are struggling to hold on to their faith as they do so. I just want to start by saying that it's right that your faith should be shaken if you are going through a period of pain or grief, because that shows that it's integrated. That it's not, you don't hold your faith in a watertight compartment separate from every area of your life. So if that's you, don't add a sense of guilt to all your other problems. It is proper and appropriate. Your faith should be shaken and should suffer along with the rest of you. And remember that shaken faith is still faith. So with that introduction, let me tell you of an occasion when a surgeon, an anaesthetist, an architect, and a politician were discussing which is the oldest and most venerable profession. And the surgeon said, well, clearly surgery is the oldest and most venerable profession. If you look at the book of Genesis, God takes a rib out of the man, makes it into a woman. That's clearly the... Thank you. I think the sedative needs to be in their cups of tea. It's clear that the first surgical operation, so clearly surgery is the oldest and most venerable profession, which the anaesthetist says, oh, please, what does God do just before that? Puts the man into a deep sleep. First case of anesthesia. It's something we have in common with preachers. Clearly, anesthesia is the oldest and most venerable profession. At which point the architect says, oh, come on. He said, that's Genesis 2. What happens in Genesis 1? God creates the heavens and the earth. He brings order out of chaos. First piece of architecture. Clearly, ours is the oldest and most venerable profession. In which case, the politician said, but who created the chaos? I'm sure that that is a uniquely British problem, and your politicians are all cases of wild efficiency and virtue. But that's the question that I want to look at with you a little bit this morning, is who created... Can you check the microphone on? Oh. They probably don't want it on. This one's on. And this one. No, that's my mobile phone. Cue that to go off a little bit later. That one says it's on. It says... Shall I just keep whittering on? Very good. Can you hear? Yeah. Could you not hear before? How come you were laughing? You just politely looked at when I was laughing at my own jokes and joined in. What an impressive crowd you are. I want to look at the question of where the chaos comes from. If the world is created by a loving and good and all-powerful God, why is it so chaotic? Not just chaotic, but tragically chaotic, such that people get crushed and hurt through the ill-fitting interactions of the universe. And I want to look at 4 arguments which I think are useful, that people have sometimes put forward in the history of the church to deal with the problem of evil, But each of them is, I think, unsatisfactory. By the way, do you have a handout as well? Everybody's got one of those. That's great. So 4 useful but ultimately unsatisfactory answers, and then I shall try and leave you with one which is, in my view, less unsatisfactory than the others. So that's where we're going, and then we have a chance for some discussion and questions. So useful but ultimately unsatisfactory argument number 1, the free will argument. Suppose instead of being married to my very lovely wife, I was in love with a woman called Gertrude. And I ought to point out at this point that Gertrude is a fictitious character, and any resemblance to any human personage, living or dead, is purely unintentional. Possibly Freudian, but we're not going there. And just suppose that Gertrude didn't return my love. I know it's stretching credibility, but there's no accounting for lack of taste. So I love Gertrude, but she doesn't love me. So far, so bad. But suppose further, I pour out my woes to a psychiatrist, and at the end of the session, the psychiatrist says to me, look, I happen to be able to hypnotize people. It's one of the tricks of the trade I use. I use it to cure people of wanting to smoke, that sort of thing. Why don't I, says this psychiatrist, why don't I meet up with Gertrude, hypnotize her, pretending it's just for fun, and while she's under hypnosis, tell her that when she wakes up, she'll be madly in love with you and that she'll consider you the most attractive, witty, and intelligent man she's ever met. And supposing I agree to this on the grounds that it's purely therapeutic for Gertrude, healing her of her current blindness and helping her to see things the way they truly are. And supposing it worked, would I feel satisfied with the love I received? Would I feel affirmed and wanted and chosen and cherished, knowing all along that it was a sham? It was a pre-programmed reaction in her and not a freely chosen self-offering and self-giving. I can't imagine anyone being satisfied with that, or if they were, I don't think they would know the meaning of the word love. Because love has to be freely given, or it's not love. I would rather forfeit Gertrude's love than force it, because love that is forced is not love at all. So it is, I suggest, with God. He could no doubt have created a world in which there was no suffering. By programming, by brainwashing, by hypnotizing, by controlling all his creatures so that they always did what he wanted them to do. By presetting them to love him and to love one another. He could have refrained from giving us any real freedom, letting us make any real choices or any real decisions. He could have kept all power tightly in his own hands, and thereby he could have ensured that only what he wanted to happen would ever happen in his world. I take it that God could have made a world like that. But if you were God, would you want to make a world like that? Because if there's no real freedom, there's no real love either. Your creatures wouldn't love you. It would be a pre-programmed sham. And actually, you wouldn't love them either, because if you did, it would simply be you loving yourself. Because if you kept all power tightly in your own hands, you'd actually be the only one who did anything in your world. You'd be the only one who acted in your world. The whole thing would be a complete pretense. A toy one. If you remember the Mr. Bean sketch, where Mr. Bean sends himself a birthday card and then opens it, and sitting his own rather tragically in a restaurant, and opens the card, oh, that's nice. I already sound like Mr. Bean before I even start trying to. But because if you don't have freedom, you can't have love. If you're not able to make choices, you don't have a character. If you don't have power, you're not a person, you're a robot. And I'm not sure I would want to make a world like that any more than I'd want the love of a hypnotized Gertrude. Give your creatures freedom and choice and power, however, and they become different from you. They become real people, making real choices, forging real characters of their own, capable of real relationship and of genuine love. Now, a world like that would be meaningful and worthwhile, because in a world like that, love would mean something because it would be freely given. The only problem, of course, in a world like that is that love can be withheld as well as given. In a world where people are different from God, there's necessarily the risk that they may act differently from how God would like them to act. They may use their freedom in ways that hurt God, hurt others, and hurt themselves. That's always the risk when you let power out of your own hands. Ask any parent. Freedom is essential because without it, existence is meaningless, but freedom can be abused. And that, says the free will defense, is precisely what has happened. That's why the world is the way it is, because it's a real world and not a sham world. It's a free world and not a robotic world. And tragically, we've often used our God-given freedom to choose what is wrong, to choose what looks good for us at the expense of what is good for others. So why did God create a world full of suffering? Answer, according to the free will argument, is he didn't. He created a world that was good, but free. And it is our abuse of that freedom that's brought about the suffering. Now, as I say, the argument I've been mounting so far is what is technically known as the free will defense, so-called because it seeks to defend God against the charge of being to blame for all that's gone wrong in his world, by attributing the evil and suffering to the free will that he gave to men and women, and by suggesting that it was nevertheless a good thing that we were given that freedom. And it's an argument that in its more philosophical articulations has been shown to be logically watertight, except for one obvious gaping hole. And that is this. The free will defense may account for why our world has hatred in it, why it has murder in it, why it has wars in it. But what about diseases? What about earthquakes? What about drought? What about famine? They're not the products of human malevolence. They seem to be built into the very way the world is. How can we explain why that sort of tragedy is allowed to disfigure God's creation? So the free will defense is useful, I think, because it explains very well why God might allow us to do nasty things to each other. It explains moral evil. But it's ultimately unsatisfactory because it fails to explain natural evil, that which happens without any human intention or malevolence. So let's look at useful but ultimately unsatisfactory answer number 2, and let me assure you they get shorter as we go. The second is called the suffering is good for you argument. Suffering is good for you argument. There are those who think that suffering from natural causes is good for us. It is character building. It is soul making, is the technical term. They believe that God is justified in making the world a place of suffering and a vale of tears because it will be better for us to have gone through such suffering than it would have been without. Now, they're quite passé, and I don't know if they're still around. Do you know about the Chicken Soup for the Soul books? You still know about those? Okay. They're subtitled Stories to Warm the Heart and Inspire the Spirit. There's also a series of parodies of those books called Chicken Poop for the Soul, subtitled stories to harden the heart and dampen the spirit. And I think you probably already know me well enough to know which I prefer. Not called Dr. Evil for nothing. And there's one in there that should be read, and I'm not going to attempt particularly this side of the pond, should be read with a kind of Disney voiceover voice. I guess the first important lesson my dad taught me was to be independent. I was just 4 years old when he took me to the shopping centre and left me there. I'll never forget that feeling as I watched him drive away with just that little loving wave. A few days later, when that nice policeman brought me home, my dad and I both knew I'd learned a very important lesson. I'll never forget the day of my 9th birthday. Dad was driving and I was next to him in the passenger seat. Suddenly he screamed, "Think fast!" and jumped right out of the car. I had to learn to drive right there on the spot. But as long as I live, I'll never forget that broad, proud smile on his face when I pulled that old car up the driveway. That was my old man. But as Dad got older and that cough became worse, he knew he wasn't going to be always there for me to make sure I could handle the real tough times. I was 14 years old, I remember, when the police came to the high school to arrest me. As they booked me, they explained that an anonymous caller had informed them that I'd held up a convenience store. I smiled. That was my old man. But 2 days later, he was right there to bail me out. My old man isn't here anymore, but I never forgot the lessons he taught me. So sometimes late at night, when I'm sitting there on the floor, I look at my son sleeping like an angel, and I know that someday soon I'll be taking him to the mall, just like my old man. You get the point. He inflicts horrible things on his son because it will be good for him and build up independence and maturity and character. And it's not without its truth. God can and does bring good out of suffering. I had just before being ordained, I had a year of intense depression and doubt. And I look back to that as my main qualification for ministry. But it's ultimately unsatisfactory for 2 reasons. First of all, the miracles of Jesus. When Jesus healed people, he didn't seem too concerned about the benefits of which he was thereby depriving them. He didn't say, "No, I'm not going to heal you. The suffering's doing you good. The illness is a real blessing. So I'm going to leave you like that. You have a good day now." Or if he did, it was never recorded. No, he just went right ahead and healed them. For him, suffering and death were distortions of God's good creation. They were things to be fought against. They were things to be eradicated, not things to be rejoiced in and learned from. And it seems to me that we who follow him should have the same view and fight the same fight. And secondly, some suffering is just so appalling that it seems obscene to talk of the good that might come from it, as if that somehow outweighs the evil of the suffering itself. It somehow makes it okay, but it's not okay. And I think it's glib talk that belittles people's experience of their own suffering. So yes, God does bring good out of suffering. I know that from my own experience. I expect many others do from theirs. But I don't think that lets him off the hook. The third useful but unsatisfactory argument is that natural evil, earthquakes, diseases, things that don't seem to be obviously caused by human choice, often turn out actually that they have been caused by human choice. A long time ago, there was a ferry disaster in the UK called the Herald of Free Enterprise. Was this ship that was going from the UK to Zeebrugge in Belgium, and it, as it left Zeebrugge on its way back, it overturned and there was huge loss of life. It looked like it just got hit by a freak wave and sank and it was a case of clear natural evil. The more that came out about it, the more investigative journalists looked into it, the more it became clear that the company had been taking shortcuts with safety measures so as to minimize the travel time, maximize profit, and what initially looked like a case of natural suffering actually turned out to be a case of moral evil. Or take the famine in the Sudan in the 80s. Initially looked like a clear just crop failure, but actually there was plenty of food. It just couldn't get transported to the places that need it because there was a war, civil war going on. So again, what initially looked like a case of natural evil turned out to be a case of moral evil. So I think this is a useful argument. It's a useful reminder to look carefully to see what is actually the cause of what is going on. It whittles away at the problem, but it doesn't solve it. It's ultimately unsatisfactory because you can't trace all disasters to human agency. If somebody gets hit by lightning, it's difficult to blame any human agency. So fourthly, the fourth useful but unsatisfactory answer is that natural disasters occur because of the disruption caused by the fall, i.e. by the rebellion and the sin of Adam and Eve. That has somehow distorted the way in which the world operates. That the disruption of our relationship with God, that they hide from God, distorts the relationship that they have with each other. They blame each other. Their children kill each other. It affects their relationship with themselves. They feel shame. And what is shame other than one bit of us being unhappy with another bit of us? And it disrupts their relationship with the natural world. You get thistles, toil, and pain in childbirth happening. So that is suggesting that it is fundamentally our relationship with God and the brokenness of that that's caused all the other brokenness, including the brokenness of our relationship with the natural world. Now, I think that's a useful analysis. It's suggesting that sociological divisions and psychological divisions and ecological divisions are ultimately the consequence of the profound theological division between us and God. It's useful. Secondly, I think it's hopeful, because it means that if you can do something about that broken relationship between us and God, you can, in time and in principle, heal all the others as well. And I think it's plausible. So interrelated is our world. The more we find out about it, the more interrelated the different levels seem to be, such that the famous butterfly effect means a butterfly beating its wings in Madagascar can cause a hurricane in Hawaii. And if that's the case, it doesn't seem to me strange that what happens in the spiritual dimension could influence and impact what happens in the physical dimension. But it won't do in the end. Because if there's any truth to modern science at all, there's been pain and killing and suffering and death and predation in the world long before human beings even emerged. If the world is out of sync because we're out of sync with God and one another, you might be able to understand why natural disasters occur now, but why before the fall? But why before the human fall? Why before Adam and Eve? Why before human beings even emerged? How can we reconcile what we see from science, that as far back as we have evidence from the fossils and the records, we find evidence of one species preying upon another for its very survival? How can we reconcile all that with the Genesis story, which sees that all that has gone wrong as the result of human disobedience, and presents the time before the fall as a time of harmony, peace, and bliss? Or does it? I used to think it did, and then I looked more closely, and I found that it doesn't. For one thing, there's the serpent. However you interpret the serpent, there is a bit of the physical world that is acting actively against the purposes of God before human beings rebel. So even before the human falls, something has gone profoundly wrong. And secondly, God commands human beings to fill the earth and subdue it, which suggests there's something that needs to be subdued. There's something that needs to be put right. There's, again, something that has gone profoundly and radically wrong, even before human beings go wrong themselves. So if the stuff that needs subduing, why is the stuff that needs subduing? What's gone wrong? It's speculative. I can't prove it. It's not taught in the Bible, though I think there is biblical evidence for it. It's not the teaching of any major denomination. It's not in the creeds. You don't have to believe it to be a Christian. You get the picture. I'm basically a maverick, and take it or leave it. All I claim for it is that it is a hypothesis that fits the facts. And by the facts, I mean both the biblical facts and the scientific facts. And this is it. And we can discuss it afterwards. Jewish and Christian tradition has always held that human beings are not the only free, rational beings in existence. Jewish and Christian tradition has always held that there's a whole spiritual dimension of which we are normally unaware, but which may be nonetheless real for that. The realm of the angelic and the demonic. Jewish and Christian tradition believe that the angels were given the job of caring for creation, but that there has been a rebellion within that dimension, the fall of the angels. That prior to the human fall, and that's really important, prior to the human fall, there was an angelic fall. The whole Lucifer being expelled from heaven story. And all that I'm suggesting, all that's new here, is that that could have distorted the way in which creation developed, luring it away from God's original harmonious purposes for it. So my scenario, and it's one of my favorite words, scenario. I use it whenever I can. It reminds me of a kind of Shakespearean character. Scenario. In love with the fair agenda, or something like that. My scenario is this. God begins the process of creating. Everything is in harmony with everything else because it's in harmony with Him. You get the fall of the angels, rebellion within the angelic and spiritual dimension. That creates division, distortion, pain, suffering, death, predation. Human beings evolve by what is now a painful, competitive, and violent process, but which was never intended to be that. And when they have emerged, God intends human beings to undo the evil that the angelic fall has caused. God intends human beings to fill the earth and subdue it, bringing it back to that order and that harmony which was always God's intention and purpose for it. Instead of being the solution to the problem, however, we become part of the problem by joining in the rebellion. That's why Genesis 3 can say it's all our fault, even though these things occurred before us, because had we remained faithful, we would have eradicated them. So the continued occurrence of evil and suffering is due to our disobedience, even though their original occurrence was due to the angelic fall. And if you want to know what it would have looked like for human beings to heal creation, look at the person of Jesus. Here at last is a human being doing what human beings were always intended to do, healing the wounds and the hurts and the divisions and the distortions of our world, stilling the storms, healing the sick, raising the dead. Here at last, the destructive effect of the fallen angels is being put right, and creation is beginning to be set free from its bondage to decay, suffering, and death. Why did God let the angels rebel in the first place if he knew that they were going to have that sort of effect? Well, because he didn't want to make them robots any more than he wants to make us robots. He didn't want to force their love any more than he wanted to force ours. He's just not the tyrant sort of God who insists that he makes all the decisions and he exercises all the power and no one has the freedom to gainsay him. He's the sort of God who gives his creatures real freedom, lets them make real choices and real decisions, even if their decision is to withhold their love. He will not force us. So we come back full circle to the free will argument. We come back to the position that all evil is the result of creatures abusing the free will that God has given them, but not just the human creatures. You've got to factor in the other aspects and dimensions of God's multidimensional world, namely, in particular, the spiritual dimensions of the angelic and demonic. So that's my suggestion. Completely uncontroversial. Can't imagine there'll be any questions. All I claim for it is that it enables us to say what we need to say. It enables us to say what we need to say theologically, which is that God is not the author of evil and suffering. God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. It enables us to say what we need to say pastorally to those in pain, that what you are going through is not the will of God. Because we tend to think that God's behind our illness or our bereavement or whatever it is. And at the very time when we most need to know that God is with us and for us on our side, we actually think of him as being against us and the cause of our problem and pain. And my suggestion enables us to say, no, God is not against you. Your suffering is part of the evil that free creatures are brought into the world, and God is against it, and he is for you. And finally, it enables us to speak with hope. Because if suffering doesn't belong in God's world, if it's not something God intends or wants or has built into his world, if it's something extraneous to it, then it can be rooted out. If suffering was not the first word about creation, it need not be the last. And if all evil is ultimately moral evil, and if sin has, in some sense, been dealt with on the cross and Satan defeated, then we can look forward to that day when we see creation healed of all that currently mars it. A day on which all created things will be at peace with each other because they're at peace with their maker. The wolf lying down with the lamb, the lion eating straw like the ox, the eyes of the blind open, the ears of the deaf unstopped, the lame leaping, the dumb singing, the dead living, the wilderness blossoming, and the whole creation flooded with the presence and glory of God.